Tonight's program is a co-production of the World Affairs Council San Francisco as well as the Council on Foreign Relations. Stephen Cook comes to us from Washington, D.C., but originally from New York City. It's a real pleasure to welcome him here to San Francisco. A few words of introduction about Stephen. He's an expert in Arab, Turkish politics, U.S. Middle East policy more generally. He previously was at the Brookings Institution, but as I said, he's now at the Council on Foreign Relations, the Washington office. His most current book is called False Dawn, Protest, Democracy, and Violence in the New Middle East. His previous book won the Washington Institute for Near East Policy Gold Medal Award in 2012. It was entitled Struggle for Egypt, and he blogs for the Council on Foreign Relations under the title From the Potomac to the Euphrates, is published widely in journals, in academic journals as well as policy journals. He's a frequent commentator on radio and TV, and so it's a real pleasure. Stephen, welcome to San Francisco.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us.
It's really nice to be here in San Francisco.
Good, good. Well,
any opportunity to get out of Washington is, especially now.
Well, it's been an eventful time here with Fleet Week last week.
Anybody here from Twitter? We can shut it down maybe?
We had an eventful bluegrass event over the weekend for anyone who's a fan, but now we have wildfires to add to the general atmosphere. Well, welcome again, and let me get into the conversation now. We'll start with a conversation between the two of us for several minutes, and then we'll move on to questions from the floor. So use the blue cards on your seats to write out a question as you wish. So the title for this evening's discussion is The United States in the Middle East, No Strategy, No Exit. Well, this is not just today's headline. It's not just something that's current. And in Stephen's book, False Dawn, he talks in some detail reviewing how both Presidents Bush and President Obama, in a sense, got us to this point where he concludes that there's no exit and no strategy. So I'm asking him if he could sort of start us off and get the conversation going by giving us his thoughts about what President Trump may be able to do, what he would like to be able to do in the face of this recent history, given the background from President Bush and President Obama, in order to develop a strategy and perhaps to find an exit or to engage more constructively in the Middle East.
Well, thanks, Neil. It's a terrific question. It's a wide-ranging question. I can spend the next hour talking about it. But you said a very, very important word in your question. You said the word strategy. Now, in Washington, D.C., if you go down on the street, I think the only other place in the world this might happen is Cambridge, Massachusetts. You go down in the street and you ask a person, who's the smartest person in the world on a topic? They'll no doubt start with themselves. And you'll ask anybody in Washington, D.C., what does strategy or strategic mean? And they will, in all likelihood, either give you a blank stare or they'll come up with some kind of synonym for important. We have, by the way, the United States government has strategic dialogues with all kinds of countries that aren't necessarily strategically important to achieving America's interests and goals around the world. So I think we need to get a baseline on what exactly that means and what's important to the United States in the Middle East. It strikes me that over the course of the last 15 or 16 years, we have had interest creep in the Middle East. We have gotten ourselves wrapped around the axle on a whole host of issues within the region for which are ancillary to what our core interests are. But let's go back to this question of strategy and strategic. It strikes me that strategy is understanding what our goals are in a region, understanding what resources we have to put towards achieving those goals. And if we don't have those resources, rethinking what's important or how to achieve those goals. Understanding how our adversaries might respond, understanding how our allies might respond, re-examining our assumptions about what's important, and then finally moving forward. It strikes me that we've had precious little of that kind of thinking in Washington. Granted, there's been a lot of crises, one crisis after another. Some of it made in Washington, some of it made in the Middle East that's made it hard. But of course, there are bureaucratic structures in the U.S. government that are charged with doing these kinds of things. So if President Trump and his advisors wanted to actually engage in an exercise in thinking about what resources we have available to achieve what kinds of goals, the first thing they would need to do is to understand what's most important to the United States in the Middle East. And I think by default, and what's been important to the United States over the course of the last 60 years remains largely what's important to the United States in the Middle East now. And that's been 3 core goals. The first one is ensuring the free flow of energy resources out of the Middle East. Now, some people might be waving their arms and saying, wait a second. President Obama actually took Sarah Palin's advice, and we did drill, baby, drill. I mean, I think that was the only piece of advice of hers that he took. And we are energy independent, or however anybody wants to define it. We rely on significantly less oil from the Middle East than we ever had before. But we do have an interest in a healthy global economy. And as long as our trading partners are dependent upon oil out of the region, then it strikes me that this is going to continue to be a core interest of the United States. The second core interest of the United States in the Middle East is helping to ensure Israeli security. Over the course of many administrations, with the broad support of the American people, it has over and over again been reaffirmed that the United States stands with Israel and helps to ensure Israeli security for a variety of important reasons, whether they're political, whether they're strategic, whether they're historical, whether they're moral. I think most Americans agree on this issue. And then the third core interest to my mind, during the Cold War, it was containing Soviet expansion into the Middle East. Maybe one day it'll be containing Russian expansion into the Middle East. We don't know. Or maybe enabling it. And since the end of the Cold War, however, it's been making sure that no other country dominates the region other than the United States, which I really see as kind of derivative of the other 2 interests. And then, of course, there's counterterrorism and counterproliferation. Those are obviously really important. So now, those have been our core interests. They are open to debate. They should be open to debate. I'm not sure that we can have a national conversation about it. We can't even have a national conversation about things that happen here in the United States. So by default, it strikes me that those continue to be the case. So what resources do we have available to meet those goals? What resources have we diverted to other goals that can then be marshaled to achieve those goals? I think the invasion of Iraq had taken us away from those kind of core interests. The freedom agenda of the Bush administration came from a good place. The United States saved the world from Nazism and Soviet communism. Now we were going to help liberate the Middle East. I think, though, that all of those things were based on a kind of misconception of what Middle Easterners themselves wanted and our role in the Middle East. But nevertheless, I think that if this administration actually has the capacity to do some strategic thinking, I think the 3 goals that I laid out, oil, Israel, and ensuring American predominance, are those goals around which to build a policy and a strategy for the region.
Now, in your book, the middle word in the subtitle is democracy, and you mentioned the Bush policy of the freedom agenda and so on. In your description of these 3+2 objectives for the U.S. and the Middle East, you don't include democracy per se. It captures, in a certain sense, the historic dilemma for the U.S. as it's torn between its interests and its values. And what you described, I think, is consistent with an interest-based, a realist-focused approach from the United States. As we look both at President Bush and President Obama, I think we see fairly strong indications of the idealist side of that tradition of U.S. being interested not just in pursuing its narrow realist interests, but also furthering U.S. values, specifically democracy. Can you tell us a little bit more about both why you excluded democracy and whether or not furtherance of democracy is an ideal worth pursuing in the Middle East?
Thanks for the question, Neil. It's a great one. I don't think democracy itself was ever an interest of the United States. The way in which, and there was huge debate in Washington during the Freedom Agenda, which I guess I played a minor role in, that what was democracy an interest, or was it the means to achieving those three core interests that I just outlined? That democracies would be better partners of the United States in the Middle East. Therefore, those three core interests that we seek to secure, it would be relatively easier and relatively less expensive to achieve those goals. That was the argument that democracy promoters were making, and that the authoritarians in the region that were allegedly providing stability were providing no kind of stability. But let me talk about, it's kind of interesting when you think about the Bush and Obama policies. So I'm looking at the room, and some of you definitely aren't old enough to remember this as clearly, and then there's some of you who are too old to remember this clearly, and then there are some of you who definitely remember this clearly. That when during the 2000 campaign, President Bush ran against nation building. He ran against this idea of American involvement in the domestic politics of countries around the world. Of course, what changed that were the attacks on New York and Washington on September 11th in 2001. And I think on September 12th, someone in the State Department wrote a memo that said for the past 60 years, we really haven't cared what's going on inside of these countries because they provided stability, and the Hosni Mubaraks of the world helped us achieve our goals and interests in the region. Now, these authoritarian systems uniquely produce terrorists, and we need to promote democracy in the region. 2 years later, the president announced the Freedom Agenda. So Bush really moved in this direction and then embraced it. If you remember his 2005 inaugural, it was all about this. He had kind of found, out with the compassionate conservatism, he found the kind of rationale for his presidency, which was promoting freedom around the world. President Obama, is a great quote by a friend who worked very closely with President Obama for a time, and who shall remain nameless, but he said, President Obama is a realist, but he feels bad about it. So when he went to Cairo in his famous Cairo speech, A New Beginning, in June 2009, he talked about a new beginning for the United States in the Muslim world. And in his priorities for the United States in the region, democracy was 7. And he said, I'm not here to push democracy on you, but if you become democratic, I'm certainly going to help you. And then when the uprisings happened around the region in May of 2011, he went to, only someone like me remembers these dates, and what exactly he said. In May of 2011, he gave his big Arab Spring speech at the State Department. And one of the things he said I thought was really important, and kind of captured this idea. He said, we need to look upon what's happened in the Middle East with humility without abdicating our values. And I think the humility part was we really are limited in our capacity to forge change or manage transitions in the Middle East, but we won't be afraid to speak out when our values, or the values that those who are trying to forge new systems, the values that they themselves espouse, if they were to contradict those values, we won't be afraid to speak out. Of course, things happen, other interests pinch, this push me, pull you between interests and values. And in fact, at those moments when the president could have spoken out about values, he decided not to, in the interest of stability, in the interest of, well, we need to work with these governments. So it's very, very hard. I don't think that democracy, as it was conceived, was an interest. And my view is close to what President Obama's was, which was, if these countries can find their way to democracy, that's great. All the better for them and their people. I don't actually know what, after the Freedom Agenda, after the invasion of Iraq, after our tragic encounters in the Middle East over the last 15 or 16 years, what resources or insight we can bring to conflicts within these countries, conflicts in places like Egypt or Libya or even Tunisia, where people define them in existential terms. I think it's very, very hard for external powers to influence politics in that way, especially one as impaired as the United States. For one, the legacy of the war in Iraq, the legacy of the excesses of the war on terror, our own political dysfunction here at home makes it extremely hard for us to play that role.
Now, some of that comes through in the book, and you seem to not quite use the term take a hands-off policy in the Middle East, but the implication of much of what you say is that it's extremely difficult, and what you just said contributes to that, for outsiders to play that role. But let me ask what the consequences of that are. To the extent that we've taken a hands-off, or that President Obama took a hands-off role in the Middle East, doesn't that open the door then for the chaos we see in Syria, and the opportunity then for Russia to take the alternate view, which is to get back in a very active way, and in so doing, deny us the space to satisfy, in a sense, your third item, which is to avoid the dominance of the region by any other actor?
Yes.
And for my next question.
Look, this, just a little bit of background. I realize, we're not here just to talk about the book, but I'm older than I look, and I guess in part this book was a midlife crisis.
Which of those three categories, by the way, do you put yourself in? With respect to,
what is it that we know about the Middle East? What have we learned? And it seemed to me, I was in writing this book trying to understand what the proper place for the United States is in the Middle East after these years of failures. And I think that you hit on a real tension in the argument that I absolutely admit to. But when I say, I'm not talking about retrenching from the region. I'm not saying we should pull back from the region. And certainly, of course, it was while I was doing the research for this book, I actually wrote a piece early in the Syria conflict saying that we should intervene. That if we didn't intervene, the humanitarian disaster that has befallen the Syrian people will. Never was I so unhappy to be right about something. But when I talk about the limited role that the United States can play, I'm talking about specifically what I just mentioned in response to your previous question about the ability of the United States to play a constructive role in forging or influencing the trajectory of politics in places like Egypt, in places like Libya, in places like Tunisia, or even Turkey, non-Arab Turkey, where, as I said, people are defining their struggles in these existential terms. And one of the tip-offs for that is in 2013, when the Egyptian military intervened in the political system and overthrew the elected president, the Muslim Brotherhood member, Mohammed Morsi, which, any Egyptians here? Okay, good. I'll call it a coup. It was a coup. It was a coup. Egyptians don't like that term. In a coup, when there were a lot of people who supported the military's intervention, who had also been in Tahrir Square protesting against Hosni Mubarak and his regime. And here they were welcoming the military back into politics. And when you ask them, almost to a person, they would say, we're fighting for the heart and soul of our country. And to me, that was a kind of telltale sign of how kind of deeply felt these conflicts were over identity, over kind of basic issues of what kind of society they wanted. And it strikes me that we were unsuccessful and would continue to be unsuccessful to intervene in those national conversations that sometimes become violent because we don't know enough. They're not our societies. And I don't necessarily believe that we know what these people want. But when it comes to something like Yemen or defeating the Islamic State in Raqqa and Mosul, I'm absolutely convinced that the United States has to play a role. In Yemen, at least, Yemen, a country that is on the verge of famine, the World Health Organization just upped its estimate of possible cholera cases to 1 million, where one of the region's wealthiest countries is engaged in a fight against the region's poorest country. we can get into the details of how the Iranians are there as well, and so on. But that our role really in Yemen should be to extricate the Saudis from this misadventure in Yemen. That we certainly have a compelling case to make when we assist and use our own firepower to destroy the Islamic State in Raqqa and Mosul. But at the same time, we should also understand that, putting warheads on foreheads, as my friends in the Pentagon might say, is not the solution to this problem. That there is a theological, political, ideological struggle that needs to be waged in the Arab and Muslim worlds. I'm not sure what role the United States has to play in that. So it's not pulling back, it's not retrenching, it's not isolationism. It's understanding what's important to us and using the resources that we have available to affect change at those places that we can do something. But forging democracy in the Middle East at the end of a tank, or through all kinds of, trying to convince Arab leaders that they should reform themselves out of power because it's a great deal for them, seems to me things that aren't going to get us anywhere.
One of the chapters in your book is entitled, Getting the Middle East Right?
I knew you were going to.
Getting the Middle East Right. And you're skeptical about that being a goal. And so let me sort of take that in one direction and pin it back to the democracy argument as well. A lot of people would say there's only one democracy in the Middle East, and that's Israel. So help us understand why it's not the case that getting the Middle East right consists, by and large, of ensuring that second point you raised, ensuring Israel's security and standing by Israel as a democracy and using it as the best demonstration effect for the rest of the Middle East.
Well, that's a loaded question. First, a little bit of explanation. When I called that chapter about the U.S. and in the Middle East, getting the Middle East right, first of all, it's in quotes. Secondly, it's to punk my readers, essentially. It's so someone will say, oh, okay, here's the guy from Washington. He's going to tell us what we should do in the Middle East. Or it's for someone who's going to pick it up and read that and say, oh, okay, what kind of crazy harebrained scheme is this guy from Washington going to get us into now? What country does he want to invade next? It's not that at all. The radical intellectual project in writing this was to say that these are things we should not be doing, that we should have a smarter, more limited set of aims in the Middle East, given our encounter with the region. Just that there are some conflicts to which the traditional tools of American diplomacy just don't apply right now. Now, you get to this question about Israel. Certainly Israel is more democratic than other countries in the region. But I think given the history, given what has happened there, the dispossession of Palestinians, the continued search for justice there, the dark underbelly of Zionism, which is like the dark underbelly of a lot of nationalisms, it's very, very hard to imagine Israel as this kind of beacon for the rest of the region. I remember Shimon Peres had this whole idea about a kind of new Middle East in which Israel would play this kind of central role as a driver of change, whether it's technological change, political change, and a kind of integration. I think while it's true that many in the Middle East have become convinced that Israel is not the major threat to them in the region. I mean, you talk to Syrian refugees in the Washington area, they say, now we know that Israel is not the major threat to us in the region. And as the Saudis and others have softened their position on the Israelis because of a confluence of interest relating to Iran, Israel is not the kind of neuralgic issue it is. But that does not mean that the Arab world is ready to come to some sort of conclusion or change in its position with regard to Israel until the Palestinian issue is resolved. So it still continues to be very hard to hold Israel. And even so, this question, this was more relevant to Turkey during much of the period, 2010, 2011, 2012, up until the first half of 2013, where Turkey was held out as a model for the Middle East. I always thought that this was kind of a facile, kind of silly thing to do. Of course, there's complex events, and we want to make sense of things. But of course, Turkey's a very, very different country. And at the time that we were holding it out as a model, there was a deepening of authoritarianism in Turkey at precisely that moment. Although it is true, and I write about it in my book, there was a consistent flow of people from the Arab world to Turkey to try to understand how the Turks had resolved this problem of the accumulation of Islamist political power while advancing, at least at the time it seemed to be, advancing democratic politics in a prosperous economy.
Let me push you a little bit on Turkey because you just wandered into that area. For me, Turkey has been an interesting potential model and so on, but now things are happening where it's harder to understand, and you make the point in the book that a lot of Americans don't understand the Middle East. Help us a little bit understand what's going on with Erdogan and his preoccupation with Fethullah Gulen, and what all that adds up to. He's now held American journalists, I believe, and the implication is that he wants to construct some kind of trade for Gulen and so on. Can you tell us what's going on there?
Sure, and I know this is a very sophisticated crowd, but perhaps we need a little bit of context, just very briefly.
I stand out as one who's not in that sophisticated crowd when it comes to this issue, so just for my benefit,
just a little bit of context. The Justice and Development Party, which is led by the now president of Turkey, a guy named Recep Tayyip Erdogan, at one time partnered with a prominent Turkish cleric named Fethullah Gulen. Fethullah Gulen has been living in Saylorsburg, Pennsylvania, in the Pocono Mountains. He went into self-exile in 1999, fearing that the military in Turkey would arrest him and he would disappear in the Turkish penal system forever. Anybody here from the West Coast, from the East Coast? Of course, from the West Coast. The New York metropolitan area, New Jersey. You remember those, commercials for beautiful Mount Airy Lodge? Well, Fethullah Gulen lives very, very close to beautiful Mount Airy Lodge in the Pocono Mountains, and they had partnered together. Followers of Fethullah Gulen were, in many ways, the technocrats that made the Justice and Development Party's Turkey run economically. They staffed the bureaucracies, and together these two groups went after their common enemies: the military establishment, the Kemalist elite, who they call the White Turks. Interestingly, anybody who had kind of staunchly upheld the values of the founder of the Republic of Turkey, Mustafa Kemal, known universally as Ataturk. These two big men of Turkish politics fell out in 2013 over a variety of reasons that are not germane to this conversation, and they have been going after each other ever since. President Erdogan has clearly had the upper hand in this, and beginning in 2014, he began a purge of many of these followers of Fethullah Gulen, the Gulenists, who have often been portrayed in the media as sort of the white hats because they were the ones who were being purged by this guy who is known for his kind of charismatic pugnacity. But they themselves have not behaved quite well, upheld the law in Turkey themselves. Anyway, after the failed coup in July of 2016, this purge of Gulenists accelerated. But it wasn't just Gulenists. It was lots of other peoples. And this purge has now ensnared more than 200,000 people, which has affected even larger numbers because families are involved. Turkey is the single biggest jailer of journalists in the world now on a per capita basis. Now it has taken a very, very ugly turn. Since the failed coup, a number of American citizens have been held in Turkish prisons. They have been accused of being Gulenist sympathizers or sympathizers of a group called the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, a terrorist organization that has been waging war against the Turkish state since 1984. There is reason to believe that these charges are false and that these people are essentially being held as bargaining chips for a trade for Fethullah Gulen. The Turks have made a formal application for his extradition. Everything that we know in Washington is that they have not yet produced enough evidence to convince anybody that he was directly involved in the coup. but that it continues to work its way through the Department of Justice and the judicial system. It has now taken a further turn because you may know, but others may not, that many American diplomatic installations around the world are run by Americans, obviously, but they get a tremendous amount of help from what's called foreign service nationals. Foreign service nationals can be drivers, they can be cooks, but they're also political analysts. They help the FBI. They do all kinds of things to make these diplomatic installations run. And just the other day, one of these employees, who's been an employee of the United States government for 32 years, was arrested. He's the second foreign service national to be arrested in this purge. And the United States decided that's it. We have to be able to protect our people, and we're going to send a message to Turkey, and we're going to stop processing non-immigrant visas. The Turks have responded in kind and have escalated by going after yet other foreign service national employees of the U.S. Embassy in Turkey. So we're really at a crisis point with the Turks, and there's all kinds of questions about where Turkey is going. Will it break from the West? Will it decide to remove itself from NATO? Is it going the way of Iran? All kinds of issues like that are animating the Turkey debate now. Another
Current event, if we just focus on current events, we may never end this evening, but a lot is happening there. Another current event seems to be the collapse of ISIS. That is, their last redoubt seems to have been taken by the Iraqi army. But in your book, you note that U.S., as part of the trying to get the Middle East right, that the U.S. can only do so much, and in general, you can only do so much with tanks and guns and soldiers, and that ultimately ISIS presents a battle of ideas, and that there's, in effect, a war of ideas going on. Who's winning that war?
That's a great question. And it's hard to know because think back to 2003 up until now. How many turning points have we heard about in the Middle East? It's certainly the case that the United States and its coalition partners have defeated ISIS in Mosul. It is essentially on the run in Iraq. It collapsed just this week in another stronghold in Iraq called Hawija. It is being destroyed in Raqqa as we speak, and so ISIS is on the run. But of course, it is still fighting in the Sinai Peninsula. It is regrouping in Libya. It's active throughout Africa. It will be atomized, and it will continue to. Its followers will continue to perpetrate violence in places like Baghdad, as well as Paris and Brussels and London. So this is, as I said in what I was saying in the book, is that we can be efficient in killing these people, but bullets are not efficient in killing an ideology. And whenever I do one of these talks, someone always asks me for the silver lining. So here's the silver lining that I'm going to give you. I don't think we have a tremendous role to play. We, the United States, have a tremendous role to play in this war of ideas, and I don't think that we should. But if you take a look at what's happening, some of the dynamics in the Arab world, in the Muslim world, is that people are addressing and taking on the Islamic State's worldview head on in social media, in satire, in their writings, in books, in articles. And I think that's happening. I think it's going to take a long time. I don't think it's something that the United States should take control over. I don't think that the best spokesmen for these things are the kind of compromised state clerics of countries, but that people, young people, old people, are rejecting this worldview. By no means has it been won, and it is a potent appeal that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi has. It is. If you are a young Tunisian in inland Tunisia, in that same town, Sidi Bouzid, where this young man, Mohamed Bouazizi, began the uprisings around the region in an act of self-immolation, and you go back there and you talk to these young, predominantly men, not much has changed in Sidi Bouzid. So they're unmoored, they're alienated, and that call, previously from Raqqa and Mosul, but maybe from someplace else soon, does have an appeal. It gives people a sense of mission and meaning and being part of something. and this is what this battle is about. And until though these countries can establish meaningful politics that is inclusive, that resolves some of these kind of core questions about who we are, what kind of society we want, what kind of organizing principles of government we want, the relation between religion and society and religion and state. There are going to be these groups that fill these cracks and attract young, alienated people to them.
Let me just pursue that a little bit, and then we want to take questions from the floor, and they're always more interesting from the floor than what I present. But let me just ask a little bit further. In your book, you talk about the sense of wanting to have ownership of the uprisings in the various countries, in Tunisia, in Libya, in Egypt, and elsewhere. Sense of ownership having to do with a desire for sense of dignity, a sense of self-respect, a sense of the locals being in charge of the future of their country. And what you just said about the opposition to ISIS sort of fermenting a little bit within the community, do you think there's some traction taking place there? Is there a sense of ownership also happening with respect to that opposition stream to the ISIS message?
I think undoubtedly, and I think again, this is the silver lining, is that I was in Tahrir Square at the beginning of the January 25th uprising for the first few days, and even in my limited time, it was clear that this was a moment of empowerment and tremendous dignity, and that there is this continued effort to at empowerment, and this idea of confronting this ideology that is espoused by ISIS is part of that. There is now no one single narrative that states can control in the region, try as they might. And so this empowerment, this sense of dignity that comes on the heels of these uprisings, although they failed to produce democratic politics, has nevertheless empowered people to take on narratives that they don't like. And I think that we should be encouraging from afar. That we have this tendency, we want to kind of jump in and organize it and fund it, and I think we let a million flowers bloom.
Let me turn to some of the questions from the floor, and there are a couple here that are connected, and so I'll read them directly. First is, what are the consequences of budget cuts in Washington, which provide humanitarian aid to Middle Eastern countries? And the second question comes from a different audience member. How effective do you see humanitarian aid as either soft or hard power in influencing relations with Middle Eastern countries?
They're great. They're great questions. And let me start out with an admission that I will. Some trepidation here. When President Trump went to Riyadh in his big trip to the Middle East, this was this summit that he had, where he was going to unify the region against extremism and against Iran. The thing with the orb and the sword dance. It was, if you strip away kind of the particularities, even the peculiarities of this administration, and whether by accident or by design, there are things that the president had said in Riyadh that were not terrible, and that were consistent with this idea that we really do not have the capacity to influence the trajectory of politics in these countries. So I wasn't, crazed over what he said. What did make me crazy, and what has continued to make me crazy, was the absolute gutting of the foreign affairs budget. In broadly speaking, our ability to conduct diplomacy, but in terms of our assistance to these countries. And there's a something that I've thought for a long time, that in the freedom agenda, we reprogrammed funds to do things that didn't have a real clear objective, that seemed to me throwing good money after bad. My favorite example is we reprogrammed money to have a good governance conference with Egyptian governors. And for anybody here who knows anything about Egypt, Egyptian governors are either retired military officers or police officers who have a very different definition of good governance. But we were going to go and, contractors for USAID were going to give all these presentations about what good governance meant. But we had taken money away from other worthy programs in USAID. For example, helping rural farmers in Upper Egypt plant better and as a result increase their incomes. And it strikes me that we should be using some of this money to get back to some of these kinds of basics. What have we done in the Middle East? We've done some really tremendous things in terms of infrastructure, potable water, electrification, rural development, preservation of antiquities that we got away from doing. And it seems to me that maybe those are worthy things that we should be doing again. But if you're going to gut the foreign affairs budget by a third, I don't see how we could possibly do that. I don't know whether that's going to make people feel better about us if we go back to those kinds of basics. But that to me isn't as important as perhaps doing things that will help people. Maybe over the course of a generation, that's better to me than doing a good governance conference at the Four Seasons Nile Plaza with a bunch of goons, essentially.
Secretary Tillerson is in the middle
You're not
of
going to ask me a moron question, are you?
things right now. No, I'm not.
Thank
I'm
you.
not.
Please. Thank you.
But he did
Alhamdulillah.
contribute a new phrase to our lexicon apropos of the visit to Saudi Arabia, when he clearly knew what he was doing in that environment, and he turned to someone and said, "This is not my first sword dance."
Yes.
So a variant on "This is not my first rodeo" from the Bush years. Talk a little bit about the Israel-Palestine issue. There are a couple of questions that are asking about that. One is, can you envision a future where we are no longer, in a certain sense, connected with Israel? And what is your sort of prognosis for how things will go forward between Israel and the Palestinian Authority?
Well, first, I really cannot imagine. I mean, maybe it's lack of imagination. I don't see a future where we are disconnected from Israel. I think that there are too many facets of that relationship. It has become too institutionalized over a long period of time. I used to argue with my friends in Washington who would freak out that President Obama was torturing the Israelis. And I would say to them, first of all, I don't know what he's doing. He's giving them, $38 billion worth of weapons over 10 years. That's torturing, but okay. But let's stipulate that the president is torturing the Israelis. I was like, isn't this kind of a situation you want? Clearly, the president of the United States and the Israeli prime minister cannot stand each other. I mean, this was since, remember George Bush, the father, he'd start talking about Israeli settlements and he'd get that vein in his neck. I mean, you hadn't seen anything like that since then. I mean, Obama would be grinding his teeth and Prime Minister Netanyahu would be looking everywhere other than at President Obama. Yet the relationship continued to work at that institutional level, sophisticated levels of military cooperation, security cooperation, the Congress continuing to appropriate aid to the Israelis. It all worked very, very well. The Israelis were not lacking anything in terms of defending themselves during that period. So it's hard for me to see, given all the facets of this relationship, that there would be distance. Of course, the world can turn. 25 years ago, someone might have asked, another guy sitting here and said, can you imagine a world where we're detached from Turkey? And they'd say, oh, of course not. We stood shoulder to shoulder in the Korean War, and here we are. We're at loggerheads with the Turks. But it strikes me that the relationship between Israel and the United States and Turkey and Israel is a kind of fundamentally different thing. Now, what are the prospects for peace is, I think, the question. I don't think that there are prospects for peace. And it strikes me in Washington that we still talk about the two-state solution when all the available evidence would suggest that the chances of it really don't exist, and that we periodically embark on these peace processes when the structure of the conflict is such that it seems unresolvable. That's to say that the minimum requirements for peace that the Palestinians have are things that the Israelis can't possibly do because of their domestic politics. And the minimum requirements for peace for the Palestinians are things that the Israelis couldn't possibly do, and vice versa. I always mess that up. I can't remember which one I used. So that it makes it extremely difficult to have a fruitful negotiation. Now, we believe, okay, well, if we establish, bridging proposals and that we can alter the interests of both the parties, haven't we been doing that for a really long time? What is it that we don't know about this conflict that that can suddenly we'll discover and that will change the nature of it, that it makes it resolvable? I will, again, in speaking to someone who knows a lot about this, said to me once, in a kind of stunned way, said, you can actually pile all the proposals for peace between Israelis and Palestinians from the floor to the ceiling, and they all basically say the same thing. And I was like, yes, they do. Yet we haven't gotten there. So I'm deeply and profoundly pessimistic that we'll find some way for peace. But the fact that we continue to think in terms of a two-state solution, I think is problematic because it gets in the way of thinking about what the reality is or some other types of solutions or being more creative about it, because we're locked into thinking that there will be two states, and I find it very hard to believe that that's the case.
On that note, what's your sense for the possibilities for burying the hatchet, if that's the right term, between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas in Gaza?
Like I say, when people ask me about the Cyprus conflict, just call me when it happens, and I'll be, and then I'll believe it, and then call me 6 months later if it's still intact. I think that this is it would be better if the Palestinians got their domestic house in order. It would be better if the Israelis also had their domestic house in order, but I don't see how that's really going to happen. Look, if I was Palestinian, I would say, why don't we just dissolve the Palestinian Authority? It's become basically a mechanism of patronage as well as the subcontractor for Israeli security, yet the Israelis continue to do things that undermine the whole rationale for the Palestinian Authority, which was to build the institutions of a Palestinian state. So again, the way we think about it, and questions about two states and peace seems to me not consistent with our reality.
There may be more questions in the bunch of questions that just came in on this, but let me just switch over for a moment to sort of the other end of the Middle East, if you will. And one question was specifically with respect to Saudi Arabia. Will a future Saudi king, Mohammed bin Salman, be positive for U.S. foreign policy in the region? And I guess I'd expand that and say be positive for peace in the Arab-Israeli confrontation.
My view of Mohammed bin Salman is colored by my view of Egypt, actually. Mohammed bin Salman, for those of you who don't know, is this 32-year-old crown prince of Saudi Arabia, and his big signature thing, besides getting Saudi Arabia into the war in Yemen, has been something called Vision 2030, which is to kind of remake the Saudi economy and society and open it up and so on and so forth. To me, and the argument for Vision 2030, which I think is kind of funny when you think about it, like what's perfect vision? It's 2020 vision, not 2030 vision. So, but of course they're talking about the year 2030. But still, it's kind of funny. Anyway, when you talk to Saudis about it, they say, well, we have no choice. Our economy is completely irrational, and we have to rationalize the economy, and we have all these young Saudis, and we need to employ them, and we need to think about a post-petroleum era in our economy, and so on. And all of those things are true. And the reason why Mohammed bin Salman actually reminds me of Gamal Mubarak, President Mubarak's second son, who was supposed to be, maybe, possibly, the leader of Egypt, had the uprising not happen, is that Gamal Mubarak also in 2004 embarked on a program. It wasn't as well articulated as this Vision 2030 because, of course, he didn't hire McKinsey to do it for him, was to fundamentally alter the way in which business and politics was done in Egypt. And that was quite destabilizing because there are vested interests around these kind of irrational politics. There are vested interests around the irrational politics, the irrational nature of the Saudi economy. That is to say that the Saudi economy is, if you're an economist, you look at it and you say, wow, this is really messed up. This is totally irrational. Why do they do this? But there's a certain rationality to the kind of political economy, that the way in which it's worked has essentially kept peace on the Arabian Peninsula among these kind of different factions within the family and tribes and the clerical establishment. And what Mohammed bin Salman is proposing is to fundamentally alter that. And that is going to produce a response. That may be destabilizing. Now, what I say to the Saudis is go forth, do what you need to do, but be aware that what Mohammed bin Salman may be doing may be destabilizing. Now, this is a long way of getting to the question about whether he'll be good for the United States. I'm going to be sneaky here and say, well, it's too early to tell. But the few indications that we have thus far would suggest, let's hope he grows into the job. I think the intervention in Yemen was not well thought out.
And you see him primarily behind that.
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear. Of course, they've tried to hang it on other people now, but yes, he was the primary driver behind that. This was done to prevent the destabilization of the Arabian Peninsula. It is destabilizing the Arabian Peninsula. Now, ultimately, we're going to have to come to his rescue. And the kind of way, and we're at fault in this as well, but the kind of way in which Mohammed bin Salman, but the Saudi establishment in general, has kind of pathologically defined their power, their geopolitical problems in sectarian terms is not good for us. And we buy it, hook, line, and sinker. I mean, how many times does someone say, the sectarian divide in the Middle East? And so when you reduce something to that kind of identity level, it obscures what's really happening. What's really happening in the Gulf is competition between the two big players in the Gulf, Iran and Saudi Arabia. When it's reduced to Sunni versus Shia, which is how the Saudis have looked at it and how they kind of impress upon us how we should look at it, and the actions that they've taken in Bahrain, in Yemen, and other places, and kind of frame the debate, makes it much, much harder to imagine a solution to this problem without a lot of violence. And we're, of course, there, and we're committed to Saudi security. That, to me, that's why I'm hoping he grows into the job.
Let's take a
I'm going to Saudi Arabia, so I'm being perfectly circumspect here because I'd like to have a nice trip there. No, they won't do anything.
Duly noted. Good luck when you get there.
Nice. I got my visa
watch
today.
Watch out for those swords.
Fine. No problem.
Let's take that the Saudi question a little bit further. What's the future of Saudi-Iranian relations?
Strategic competition and this kind of proxy battles all over the region. I don't see
more of the same.
I don't see any kind of breakthrough. Javad Zarif, the kind of, lovely sounding and sort of debonair foreign minister of Iran. He has such a great accent, and I'd love to have that accent. I have a Long Island accent. I'd love to have that accent. He has said, we will have, a diplomatic opening after the Hajj, and we'll work things out, and so on and so on. And they've had this kind of thing. This is not something that's unusual, and it never really happens, because in part, look, Iran is a revolutionary power. It wants to change the rules of the game in the region. Saudi Arabia is a status quo power. Why? Because the regional political order is essentially rigged that enhances Saudi security. We're the provider for Israeli and Saudi security and security, and we're the big kids on the block. And the Iranians don't like that because we have been at odds with them for so long, and they're seeking to change those rules. Now, what was a breakthrough from the perspective of President Obama and his supporters was this ability to negotiate the Iran nuclear deal, which presaged the possibility of bringing the Iranians into the region and therefore reducing these tensions so that Iran would be less revolutionary, it would cooperate, and the western side of the Gulf, that is to say the Saudis, the Emiratis, and the Kuwaitis and the Bahrainis, wouldn't be so neuralgic about the Iranians in the region. Of course, there are a number of issues that got in the way of that. And that is, of course, the fact that the Iranians have enabled the killing of 400,000 people in Syria, have extended and reinforced its influence around the region so that the Saudis feel encircled, and then prominent Iranians saying, well, yes, of course, we are encircling the Saudis. So it made it difficult to get to that place that the Obama administration had hoped, which would reduce the tensions by bringing the Iranians into the region.
It's a big region. You've got a big topic. We have a question from Bob Grady. People typically don't put their names on the cards, but in this case, someone did, and so we're happy to have Bob with us tonight. And it moves us over to the Kurdish question.
The Kurdish.
So I didn't think you'd get away without telling us, will the recent independence vote by the Kurds in Iraq, the activity now being undone by the Iraqi government, have any lasting effects at all? And it's connected with another question on the same topic. Should the U.S. be more supportive of the Iraqi Kurds' desire for autonomy?
Everybody loves the Kurds, but everybody hates Kurdish independence. It's extraordinary. I'm agnostic on this issue. I think the Kurds have been trying for almost 100 years to undo what was done to them in 1925 by the Brits and the League of Nations. I think if you travel in Iraqi Kurdistan and you ask young Kurds, and I'm talking about people who are under the age of 40 or so, first of all, none of them speak Arabic, and you ask them what is it that they share with fellow Iraqis in Basra or Ramadi or any of these places that we've come to know over the course of the last 14 years, they say they have nothing. They have nothing. And in fact, they have really, truly built the institutions of a state. And as Iraq continues to fracture, it's only, I think, natural that they're going to want to seek their independence. Now, what was the Kurdistan Regional Government's President Masoud Barzani up to when he called this independence? Well, this independence referendum, this was something of a different level. Barzani, not really a Democrat, shocking, I know, there's a parliament, there's a question about his presidential tenure, whether it can be extended, and there was a tremendous amount of opposition to him. And as the threat of the Islamic State has receded, the political pressures in Iraqi Kurdistan have increased, and the pressure on Barzani to do something about it has obviously increased. So he called a referendum on Kurdish independence. What self-respecting party that allegedly represents Kurds and Kurdish interests is going to oppose that? So it was kind of this brilliant maneuver on his part, daring these parties to oppose him on independence. Now, of course, he got 93-point-some%. I want to meet that 7% of Kurds who voted against it. I was actually shocked that it wasn't 99.9999999% that voted for it. But it resolved that domestic politics and that problem and traded it for this problem with the central government of Iraq, Turkey, and Iran. Barzani was betting that the Turks really don't have the capacity to do much. They'll huff, they'll puff, but they're so invested in the KRG that after Erdogan makes a show of it, he really won't do much. Now, that may be a miscalculation on their part. I mean, Erdogan is in a full fight with the PKK, the Turkish Kurds, as well as trying to prevent Syrian Kurds from establishing an autonomous, maybe statelet in northern Syria right up on his border. So that may be a miscalculation, but nevertheless, that was the calculation. With Baghdad, they figured this is great leverage for us to negotiate. They were quite worried about what the Iranians might be doing, and I think that is the wild card, what the Iranians might be doing. They were quite angry at the Trump administration. The Kurds were quite angry at the Trump administration for being so vocally opposed to this independence referendum because they felt it has enabled the worst instincts of all three of these ones. The dirty secret is, of course, negotiations have already had continued between Erbil and Baghdad. The border hasn't really been closed between Turkey and the KRG. Erdogan has said 25 times, we're going to shut off the oil. We will shut off the tap. One more day, and he hasn't shut off the oil. The Iranians really do, however, have the means to do a lot of harm and mischief in the KRG and Kurdistan areas of Iraq.
I always feel apologetic. We come close to the end, and I realize there are so many good questions that I have to omit. And thank you all for very thoughtful questions. It's been a very lively discussion. Let me just conclude, or allow you a chance to conclude, with the closing line of your book. And I do recommend the book, not that this is a book talk, it's much more general than that, but it really does capture a lot of...
I recommend it also.
a lot of interesting dynamics in areas that we don't typically associate with the central problem of the Israeli-Arab conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, looking at the origins of the uprisings in Tunisia, in Libya, in Egypt, Tahrir Square, in Turkey, and the dynamics in Turkey. It's a very thoughtful and carefully analyzed book. But it does end, and I'll read very briefly. You say you conclude by saying, the future will likely be no better than when Mohammed al-Bouazizi struck the match. Is it really that grim?
I alluded to before that this book was a productive midlife crisis. Instead of buying a Porsche or having an affair, I wrote a book. And
Wise choice.
What has struck, yes, very wise choice. What has struck me about the Middle East is with all of what seems like so much change, there's been so much continuity, and that in the continuity of politics, things are contested and quite violent. And I go back to it. When I was writing that line, I was thinking about when I went back to Sidi Bouzid, this town in inland Tunisia, which actually played a rather important role in World War II history that was forgotten by everybody unless you were a World War II history buff. Or Rick Atkinson, who wrote the wonderful book on the North Africa campaign.
Another great book.
A great book. Another great book. And
all three of them.
You go back to it, and that it is the same place it was after all this change. And when you ask one of these guys who still pushes a fruit and vegetable cart like Mohammed Bouazizi did, and you say, what has changed? They say nothing, just the street names. There's now Mohammed Bouazizi Square and January 14th Revolution Street. But other than that, the same kind of challenges, the same kind of dynamics are there. Now, that may suggest that there are uprisings in our future. Of course, there's no way to predict these things. But if you are a young Egyptian and 6 or 7 years ago you were hoping for something better, what you've gotten actually is Hosni Mubarak on steroids. That vision that we had about a future Middle East with these kind of tech-savvy activists, we've actually gotten tech-savvy extremists. So it's a grim conclusion. My apologies, but I also think it's a deeply human story about struggle, about a desire to live in freer societies, about having dignity and feeling empowered in your life, and how those dreams are thwarted. That's what the book is really about. And I was drawn to these questions because we had this assumption that there would be that democratic pot at the end of this rainbow, because our frames of reference were things like 1989 in Eastern and Central Europe. But the question was, when I started witnessing some of these things go sideways and then bad, well, what happens if it doesn't, and why? And that's what prompted me to write, I think, this very kind of complicated and human story about the Middle East. Anyway, thank you all very much.
Very, very much.